In this video, I will show you how to automate the process of keeping your document stores up to date. Document stores are a great solution for managing all your data sources in a single container. This way, you can easily add or remove information from the knowledge base without having to change the AI Chatflow itself. But one thing you guys have been asking me in the comments is how to refresh the document store automatically when a document loader uses dynamic data. For instance, you might be scraping information from a website that changes often, or you might be pulling data from a database, like Airtable. In those situations, you might want the document store to be refreshed as soon as the data is changed, or like every hour, once a day, etc. I really want to give you the best value possible in this video, so I thought it would be fun to build a real-world application together. Here we have an AI-powered business directory. This is similar to the yellow pages, but instead of searching businesses using keywords, we can simply have a natural conversation with an AI chatbot. The business listings are actually just stored in an Airtable database, but this could be any type of data source. Like you could be scraping data from a website or pulling from a database. Now, the issue is if we add a new listing to this database, for example, let's add Oak and Barrel, which is a fictitious restaurant. We'll just enter some address over here, like so. Let's just enter some sort of phone number. Let's enter a description like a restaurant that sells steaks and sushi. Now I've committed the changes to this table, and if we go back to our chatbot and we ask something like, I'm looking for a sushi restaurant in Johannesburg, we simply get a message saying that it can't find that latest entry. And that brings us to the challenge that you guys have been facing with document stores. Whenever the data source changes, you manually have to execute the following steps. And in this video, we will automate this process, but let me show you how this works. First, you have to go to Actions, click on Preview and Process. Then we need to click on Process to load the data and chunk it. And now we get 17 documents back, which means that the latest entry has been pulled in. Now we have to upsert this data into the vector store by going to Upsert config. And then we need to click on Upsert. And now we can finally see that one record has been added and 16 records were skipped. So if we go back to our chatbot now and we ask the same question, we should get the correct response back. And we do. It's very possible that you might have a situation where you want to manually refresh the data, but in many instances, like with this business directory, we want the data to be refreshed maybe once a day or every few hours. So let's have a look at automating this process. You are going to learn a lot because in this video, I will show you how to set up the Chatflow, the document store, and we will use Airtable as our database in this video. We will also use a workflow automation tool called n8n to run this automation on our behalf, and you will also learn how to use the new Flowise API endpoints for updating the document store. First, let's create our Chatflow. I'm using a cloud instance of Flowise, but you're more than welcome to use a local instance to follow along with this tutorial. On your local machine, simply open up the command prompt or terminal and enter npx flowise start. If this is your first time running Flowise, then you will be prompted to install Flowise, so simply enter Y and press enter. And afterwards, you should see a message like this. And after that, you can access Flowise by going to localhost 3000, and you should see a dashboard like this. Now let's create the Chatflow by clicking on Add New. Let's give it a name like AI Business Directory, and let's save this. Let's add a new node. Let's go to Agents, and let's add the tool Agent node. Let's start by adding an AI model to this canvas. So under Add Nodes, let's go to Chat Models, and I'll be using the Chat OpenAI model. Now I've got plenty of videos showing you how to use Chat-O-Llama to run models locally for free on your own machine, or you could use GrokChat, which is also free, and you'll also find the video on my channel for using GrokChat. So let's add our chat model node. Let's attach this to our agent. Let's select our credentials. Let's select our model as GPT-4o mini. And I'm going to lower the temperature to 0.2 as I want our assistant to strictly follow our prompt instructions. which we will set up in a minute as well. Let's also add a memory node. So under nodes, let's go to memory, and let's simply add this buffer memory node. And let's attach it to our agent as well. Now, finally, let's add a tool node. So under Add Nodes, scroll all the way down to Tools and add the Retriever tool. And let's attach this tool to our agent as well. This Retriever tool will be responsible for connecting our knowledge base to our AI agent. For the tool name, let's call it Business Listings. And for the description, let's enter, use this tool to find information about businesses. Now, optionally, we can also enable this toggle, which will return the source documents in the chat window. Now, because this process will be customer facing, I don't want the user to see my data sources. So I'll leave this disabled. Then lastly, let's add a retriever. So under vector stores, let's add the document store node and let's attach this to our retriever tool. Great. Now we simply need to select our document store, which we haven't created yet. But before we do that, I just want to go back to our tool agent and change the system prompt. I'm going to clear this, but instead I'll paste in the following prompt. Let's expand this. You are a helpful assistant for a business listing service called AI Business Directory. Only answer questions related to the business. Your role is to assist the user in finding information related to the businesses like the location, contact information, services, and products. Use the provided tools to retrieve this information. If the answer is not in the context, then simply respond with something like, I couldn't find the information related to that business. Think carefully about your responses and ensure that the information returned for each listing does indeed belong to that listing. Feel free to pause the video and then copy over this prompt or enter something relevant to your business. Now that should be everything we need for our chatbot itself. Let's go and create our document store. So from the dashboard, let's go to Document Stores. Let's click on Add New. Let's call this AI Business Directory. Let's add this. Then let's click on this document store, which is currently empty. Now we can start adding data sources to the store. So let's click on Add Document Loader. Within here, let's click on Airtable. And now we need to provide information about our Airtable database. So let's go ahead and set up Airtable. Go over to airtable.com and sign into your account. Within the dashboard, next to Workspaces, click on Create a Workspace. Give it a name like AI Business Directory and then click on Create. And let's select Start from Scratch. Let's rename the space to something like AI Business Directory and let's press Enter. Let's also rename the table by double-clicking on this tab and let's call this Listings. And let's save this as well. Now we can define our column names as well as upload data. To speed things up, you'll find a link in the description to a CSV file which you can download for free. Then click on Add or Import, then click on CSV file, click on Browse Files, and select the file that you just downloaded. Then click on Upload one file. Let's select Create a new table, and let's click Next. Then lastly, let's click on Import. And now you should see all of these columns with some sample data. Great. Let's actually delete the table that we created earlier by right-clicking on it. Let's delete this table, and let's rename this one. So let's call this Listings and let's save this. Great, we now have a table with data that we can use. If we go back to Flowise, we first have to set up our credentials. So let's click on this drop down, let's click on Create New, let's give it a name like AI Business Directory, and for the access token, let's go back to Airtable, click on your profile, then click on Builder Hub, then under Personal Access Tokens, click on Create New Token, call it AI Business Directory. Then let's add a few scopes. First, let's add Data Records Read. Let's also add Schema Basis Read. And let's also add a base. And let's add the base that we just created, which was AI Business Directory. Then let's generate a token. Let's copy the token and paste it into Flowise. And let's click on Add. Let's also select the credential that we just created. Now for the base ID, we can simply go back to our table, and the base ID is this first part of the URL that starts with app and a whole bunch of characters after that, up until the first front slash. like so. Then for the table name, it's this section that starts with TBL, so let's copy that and paste it in here. And then the view is this part over here that starts with VIW. Let's paste it into this field. Cool. I'm also going to remove this limit as I want this loader to read all the entries in the database. And we're not going to add a text splitter at all, as Flowise will automatically create a document for each entry in the database. And we can see that 16 chunks were extracted, and that is because we have 16 records in our database. Let's click on Process to now store these changes. Let's also set up our Upsert config. So under Embeddings, because I'm using OpenAI, I'll use the OpenAI Embeddings function. I'll select my credentials. For the model name, I'm going to use text embedding 3 small, and I'll leave all the other values on their default values. Then for the vector store, I'm going to use Pinecone. Then under credentials, let's click on create new. Then go over to pinecone.io and log into your account or sign up. So the first thing we want to do is to get our API key. So go to API keys, then click on create API key. I'll call this AI business directory, and let's create this. Then I'm going to copy this key and paste it into Flowise. And for the credential name, I'll call this AI business directory as well. Let's add this. Let's also select the credential. Now for the Pinecone index, let's go back to Pinecone and let's create that index. Under database, let's click on create index. Let's simply call this Flowise. Then for the dimensions, I'll click on set type by model. I'm using text embedding 3 small. So this needs to be consistent with whatever model name you're using over here. Then I'll click on set configuration. And finally, we can click on create index. So I'll simply copy the index name and add it to Flowise. I like giving namespaces to my projects. So I'm going to call this AI business directory, and I'm going to change the top K to 10 documents. This simply means that when the user asks a question, the retriever tool will retrieve 10 documents back from the vector store. In other words, the 10 most relevant businesses to the user's query. Now finally, let's also set up the record manager. Let's click on Postgres, then under credentials, let's click on create new. Let's give it a name like AI business directory, and let's also go ahead and set up our Postgres database. To simplify the process of creating a Postgres database, let's go to superbase.com and sign into your account. From the dashboard, let's create a new project. Let's give the project a name like AI business directory. Let's also set a password. Let's also set a region, and let's click on create new project. This will take a few minutes to complete. Once the project has been created, go down to project settings, then click on database, and under connection parameters, we can find all the information needed to complete the setup. Let's start by copying the username, and let's add it to Flowise. Let's also enter the password that we created earlier, and let's click on add, and let's select that credential. Then for the host, we can copy that from Superbase and add it to Flowise. Let's do the same thing for the database name, like so. And let's also copy the port and add it to Flowise as well. Then the only other setting I want to change is the cleanup method. Let's change it from none to full. This simply means that the record manager will be responsible for preventing duplicate entries in the vector store and delete information when we delete entries from the data source. Let's save this config. Let's test it out by clicking on Upsert, and if everything was set up correctly, you should see a message saying that 16 records were added to the vector store, and if we go to Pinecone, we can see those 16 records were indeed upserted to the vector database. And if we go to Superbase, and if we go to Database, you should see this table with 16 rows. Great. So now that we have a document store, we can finally go back to our Chatflow. Let's open up our AI business directory flow, and from the document store node, let's select our newly created document store. Let's save this and let's test it out. Let's say I'm looking for a restaurant near the waterfront in Cape Town, and we instantly get a few responses back, like the waterfront seafood spot. And if we go to our table, and we can see that the waterfront seafood spot is indeed a restaurant near the waterfront in Cape Town. Now we can expose this chatbot to our users in many different ways. By clicking on this API endpoint button, we can embed this chatbot into a website, or if we have a Python or JavaScript application, we can easily integrate this into our custom applications as well. But for simplicity's sake, I'm simply going to go to Share Chatbot, let's enable Make Public, and let's copy this URL. And if we open this URL in the browser, we will be able to access our AI application from outside of Flowise. Now we can of course customize the look and feel of this application from within Flowise. So for the title, I'm going to add AI Business Directory, and I'll also link to an avatar by adding a URL to an image that is available online. And if we scroll down, we can change other things as well, like the welcome message, the background colors, font sizes, etc. I'm simply going to save these changes, and if we go back to our application and refresh it, we can see the title and avatar image over here. Oh, and we can also hide this Powered by Flowise branding. So again, within Flowise, all we have to do is go to this Powered by text color and change it to white. And of course, remember to save your changes. And if we refresh this, the Powered by text is basically gone. Now, before we move on to the automation side of this, let's simply check if our application is working. Okay, that's great. Let's also try a complex scenario. And I really love this behavior. So this is something you can't do with a traditional business directory. Let's say something like, I am planning on visiting Cape Town tomorrow. Please recommend a museum that I can visit during the day. Also, suggest a restaurant and hotel near the waterfront. Let's send this. And this is absolutely amazing. We get a museum back, and our AI assistant recommended a museum along with a restaurant and a hotel. And because this is an assistant with memory, we can definitely have follow-up conversations with this assistant as well. If you're enjoying this video, then please hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and share this video. Now let's have a look at automating updates to our document store. At the moment, when we make changes to our database, so if I add Oak and Barrel, which is a restaurant, I'll just enter something like 1 Oak Street in Johannesburg, and I'll just put in some fictitious number, and in the description I'll just enter fine dining restaurant specializing in steaks and sushi with a rating of 4.5. Great. Now, as I showed you in the intro of this video, this data will not be available to the chatbot automatically, and unfortunately we would have to go through this tedious process of manually reprocess the document loader and then manually upsert these chunks into our vector store using this button over here. Now, thankfully, Flowise thought about this already, and what they did was expose a lot of API endpoints that we can consume from outside of Flowise to automate these type of processes. Let me show you what I mean. When you go to Flowise's documentation and under the API reference documentation, you can find API endpoints for pretty much every object within Flowise, including the document stores. Here you will find APIs for creating document stores, listing document stores, fetching details of a specific store, and what we're interested in is this process loading and chunking operation, which is this step over here, as well as upsert chunks from document store, which is effectively this step over here. So to automate this process, you can use any workflow automation tool that you want, like Make.com, n8n, Zapier, etc. And I already have plenty of tutorials on my channel for setting up and working with n8n. If you do want to run n8n locally, then simply open up the command prompt or terminal and enter npx n8n start. Then click on Y to install all the dependencies, and after installation is complete, you will see a URL that you can use to access n8n. But for this demo, I will be using my cloud instance of n8n instead. So let's add a new workflow. Let's give it a name like AI Business Directory, and let's actually delete this trigger. So what we can do in n8n is set up different types of triggers. Trigger manually is simply used for testing workflows. But what we could do instead is use something like an app event, and this gives you integration with a lot of external service providers, including Airtable. So if I go into Airtable, we could trigger this workflow when something changes within Airtable. For example, if a new entry is added to our database table. But what I'll do instead is add this onSchedule node. This simply means that the workflow will run on a set schedule. For applications like this business directory, I might not want the listing to show up immediately when it's added to the database. We could definitely do that using the Airtable trigger, but I personally like to run these sort of updates once a day or once every few hours. That gives me a bit of an opportunity to first verify the data to ensure that it's not malicious or junk, or to fix typos if I made a mistake. Otherwise, that data, including all its mistakes, will be instantly added to the vector store, and users might actually see that. So let's say that I actually want to run this update like every 6 hours. Great. Next, I'm going to add a set node. We will use the set node to store certain information about our Flowise project. First, let's create a new field, and let's call this store ID. And for the value, let's go back to Flowise, and let's actually copy this value over here, as that is the unique identifier for this document store. And let's paste it into this field. I'm also going to add one more value called the Flowise base URL. Now for you, that might be localhost 3000 if you are running this locally, but since I'm using a cloud instance, I'm simply going to copy this URL and paste it in here without the front slash. So if I test this step, I am getting this JSON schema out containing our store ID and our Flowise base URL. And now we can use these values throughout our project. Now the first thing we need to do in this process is to fetch the details of our document store. We need to do that in order to retrieve each and every one of the document loaders in this document store. Although we only have one document loader, this document store could contain as many document loaders as we want. And what we want to do in our automation process is to loop through each of these document loaders and then automatically trigger the preview and process function for each of these in a loop. So let's see how that's done. To retrieve the details of a document store, we can use this get a specific document store API endpoint, which looks something like this. It's basically the Flowise base URL followed by this path, and we have to pass an ID value, which is that store ID. So we're not going to look at the documentation for each of these API calls, but I simply wanted to show you my process of figuring out which APIs to call and what these APIs need. So to call that API within n8n, let's add a new node, and more specifically the HTTP request node. For the method, we will set this as a get method. Again, the documentation will tell you what the method type should be. For the URL, I'm going to switch over to expression and click on this button just to expand the view. Then let's start with the base URL, and we can see a preview on the right hand side, /API v1 document store/store. And you might recall that we then need to pass in the document store ID as well. So let's simply grab that from this previous node, and now you should have a URL that looks something like this. Now, if we simply test the step as is, we will get a failure, and more specifically an authorization failure. And that is because Flowise is protecting their endpoints through API keys. So under authentication, let's select generic credential type, then under generic auth type, select header auth, then under header auth, select create new credential. And for the name, let's enter authorization, and this must be authorization with a capital A. And for the value, we need to create an API key within Flowise. So back in Flowise, go to API keys, then click on create key. Let's call this AI business directory. Let's add this, then let's copy this key. And let's paste it into this field. Let's save these changes. Let's click on test step. And this time we actually get a response back. Cool. And if we go to the schema view, we can see the details about our document store, like its name, and more importantly, all the different loaders. And we only have one loader, and that's this Airtable loader. But of course, if we add more, we would see all those loaders pull through as well. So I'm just going to clean up this workflow a little bit by renaming this node to get document store details. So what we want to do next is simply extract all the document loaders out of this response so that we can use them in our workflow. So let's simply add a new node. Let's add the set node. Let's rename this to extract document loaders. Let's rename this. And all we have to do to extract the document loaders into this new structure is to simply drag this loaders array into this fields to set. We'll keep the name as loaders, and we can see that this is of type array. And if we run this, all this other information has been dropped, and we now simply have a very simple structure containing only our loaders, which is much easier to work with. What we want to do now is loop through each of these document loaders. Remember, we could have multiple doc loaders, and for each of these document loaders, we want to call the API to execute this preview and process step. So let's first loop through these items by adding a new node, and more specifically the loop over items node. And because the previous node is returning an array of loaders, this loop node will automatically loop through these different loaders. So for each loader, we can delete this node and add a new node. And because we're calling an API, we'll call the API request node. Let's rename this to process chunks. Let's rename this. This method should be changed to post. Then for the URL, let's change this to expression again. Let's open this up. And again, we need to start with our base URL, followed by API v1 document store loaders / process. Then for authentication, let's change this to generic credential type. Then for the auth type, let's select header auth, and let's select our header auth that we created earlier. Now for this API, we need to pass a body. So let's enable send body. And as a reminder, all of this information is available in the Flowise documentation as well. And we only have to pass two parameters. First is the store ID, and for the value, we can go to edit fields and grab the store ID from over there. Let's add another parameter, and this one is called ID, and this refers to this document loaders ID, which we can get from this loop. And that's this ID field within the loaders array. Now let's go ahead and test the step. Now if we go back to our application, we can run this entire flow by running test workflow, and we can now go to process chunks, and from this view we can see all the chunks that were extracted during this process. You might recall that we only had 16 chunks within Flowise, but we added the 17th record in our database. And if I now refresh Flowise, we can see that the amount of chunks have changed from 16 to 17. So our API call was indeed successful, and we've just automated this process over here. Now before we move on to the Upsert logic, I do want to mention that the process of processing the chunks is asynchronous and it can take a bit of time to complete. So I actually recommend just adding a wait node into this loop to give this process some time to complete. I'll simply make this 2 seconds. So this means that when we run this flow, it will wait 2 seconds before continuing, and everything should still be okay. Now let's have a look at automating the process of upserting the data into the vector store. So that's the process of clicking this button over here. When the loop is complete, we'll add another node to this done route over here, and we will be calling another HTTP request. Let's rename this to Upsert chunks. Let's change the method to post. Then for the URL, let's go to expression. Let's open this up. And of course, we'll grab the URL from the Flowise base URL over here, followed by API v1 document store vector store insert. Then for authentication, let's change this to generic credential type. Let's change the auth type to header auth. And under header auth, let's select our header auth like so. Let's also enable send body. And within the parameters, we only have one parameter that we have to pass, and that's the store ID. So within value, let's simply go to expression. Let's expand this, and let's grab the store ID. Like so. Don't worry, these errors will all go away once we execute this flow. Let's test this workflow, and we can see that the upsert ran successfully, and we can see that 17 records were indeed added, and the old records 16 of them were deleted. So in theory, if we now go back to our chatbot, we should be able to find this new business listing, this Oak and Barrel listing over here. So let's say I'm looking for a sushi restaurant in Johannesburg, and have a look at that. Oak and Barrel came back as a response. So it seems that our workflow is indeed working. In fact, to test this out, I'm going to change the interval to minutes, and I'm actually going to change this to every 2 minutes. Let's go back to the canvas. Let's save this workflow, and very important, change this from inactive to active. So this workflow will now run every 2 minutes. Let's add a new entry to this table to see if it gets added automatically. So I've just added the AI Studio, which is an AI services company. And for the description, I'm just saying it's an AI automation agency. So let's give it a minute or two to see if anything changes on our document store. It's been about 2 minutes, so let's simply refresh this page and let's see what happens. And there we have it. The amount of chunks is changed to 18, and let's start a new conversation with our agent, and let's type, I'm looking for an AI automation agency, and it was able to pick up the AI Studio. And as you can see, our knowledge base is now automatically refreshed on a timed interval. Now finally, I do want to give you a pro tip as well. Your document store might contain loaders that do not change at all. As an example, you might have some PDF loader or a CSV file, and these document loaders never change. This is static data. If you want to change the PDF document, you effectively have to delete this PDF document loader and create a new one. So that simply means that it does not make any sense to refresh these PDF documents in your automation process. The data is static after all. So what you could do in your workflow is add one additional node. Let's move this up and let's add the filter node, like so. So now what we can do is actually filter out any document loaders that we don't want to refresh automatically. So we can grab the loader ID from the left-hand side, and we could say that we only want to refresh document loaders with an ID of Airtable, and you can add additional checks as well. So this means when we execute this workflow, all the document loaders besides Airtable will be dropped out of this array. This video was a lot of work to create, and if you made it this far, then I do want to thank you for your time. If you want to support my channel, then please hit the like button and subscribe. And if you would like to learn how to use Flowise or n8n, then check out these other videos and series over here. I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.